Thanks for coming. Like Matt said, my name's Brendan Bates. I've been working with DiUS for about a year now, lead software engineer. We are hiring, as Elliot said right at the start. DiUS is an awesome place to work. I can attest for it, if for no other reason than we have the best coffee machine in any workplace that I've ever worked. At least the most complicated one and the hardest to clean. But it's good. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about consumer-driven contract testing using Pact, which is a mouthful to say, and I'm going to stumble across it like so many times tonight, so please be nice. We're going to explore, by way of a war story, about how Pact can be possibly used to prevent production issues from occurring in the first place when you're using microservices, when you're using Helidon, because that's what you're going to do. Tomorrow when you go to work, you're going to whip up some a nice little Helidon stack. And towards the end, I'm going to actually do some live coding, not some coding on the slides, which doesn't count. So I'll whip up IntelliJ and actually do some live coding. You can laugh at me for making mistakes. So before I start, I'll do a quick poll of the audience. So who here is actually working on a system now at work, obviously, or for pleasure, that's basically composed of microservices? Yeah, some DiUS people. Okay. That's good. So out of those people, keep your hand up. Sorry. Keep your hand up. So out of those, who is actually doing contract testing within those microservices?
I don't know what you're saying.
Don't know what I'm saying? Okay. Well, that's fine. You'll learn. Of those, who's using Pact? 2. Okay, so have a look, everybody. These are the 2 experts to ask questions. If you didn't know, if you were one of the people that left your hand down when I asked who knew about it, I was in the same boat until recently. So this talk is going to be a bit of a very basic level because that's pretty much where my level is at the moment. I'm going to give a bit of an overview first up about what I'm talking about, and then I'm going to go through and explain and talk about an issue that I had at a client just recently. So you'll get to hear interesting war stories. So consumer-driven contract testing is effectively is a way to ensure that microservices, can communicate with each other using a shared, agreed-upon protocol. That's copied and pasted directly from the Pact website, I might say. Reuse is a good foundation in software engineering and presentations. Consumer-driven contract tests. So I'm going to use a couple of terms throughout the night, and it's important that you understand what these are off the bat. So contracts are written, so the contracts when you're doing consumer-driven contract testing, the contracts are written as part of the consumer test suite. Consumer, I've underlined consumer because that's important. And the contracts are verified as part of the provider test suite. Now you're probably still confused. By the end, hopefully you'll be less confused. Now there are a few different tools you can use for contract testing in Java. Pact is one of them, and that's the one we're going to talk about tonight. Because DiUS is one of the foundational members of that project. But there are alternatives. So if you use Spring out in the real world, then you've probably heard of cloud contracts. I can't attest to how good they are, but it's fairly widely used. But Pact is definitely the most widely used that I'm aware of. These are all the organizations that are currently using it. See DiUS there? The ITV story is actually pretty interesting. They put out a press release, I think, around the time of the World Cup last year, the Soccer World Cup. Football, sorry to Elliot. Football, sorry. The Football World Cup, they actually used Pact to ensure that their streaming services all worked nicely together while the World Cup was on, so that that if you're watching it on your mobile phone over in the UK, you weren't going to be plagued by the same issues that Optus had. Anybody here from Optus?
I was going to say that.
No? Okay, good. Yeah, Optus is not on there, you'll notice, yes. Yeah, that was a bit of a disaster. So one of the good things about Pact also is that it is ported to a lot of different tech stacks. So it works on JVM, obviously, that's why we're talking here tonight, but also works on Ruby, on Python, JavaScript, importantly, probably others. There are a lot of others. C#, yes, of course, yeah, .NET, definitely .NET, maybe Go as well, I think. There's Go one as well, yeah. So it works across any tech stack that you could possibly be writing microservices on these days. Which is important because you're going to be writing these contracts across a consumer which may be written in one language and a producer which may be written in another language. But if you're using Pact, they're going to be talking the same language, which, funnily enough, is called Pact. So this is where my story begins. I'm going to be telling you a story that I've fictionalized somewhat to protect the innocent. I've changed the name of the company that this is related to. So they're an insurance company, Insurance into Technology, I've called them, which we can shorten to Inotech. This insurance company obviously sells insurance policies, as insurance companies tend to do, and they build their systems in a microservice type of way. So the team I worked on was this small little team down here, small in the scheme of things. Inotech's quite a large organisation with many other teams which aren't pictured yet. My team was responsible for looking after quite a small little application in the scheme of things, which I'm going to call So You Think You're Covered. It's to describe it, I'll walk through some wireframes just to describe it so you understand where I'm sort of getting at. This application allowed you to, as a policyholder, you'd log in to So You Think You're Covered. You would then be presented with a text box where you would type in an event that you weren't sure that you'd be covered for under your policy, but you wanted to find out. So in this case, this person may have been typing the letter T, and they want to know whether they're covered by, they could be, and well, they're presented with a list of possible events that your policy may be covered by. Tornado, tropical cyclone, typhoid outbreak, tetanus infection, television defect detected, the other TDD, and possibly the worst of the lot, toddler birthday party. So this person may have checked typhoid outbreak, and that's gone too far, and they have just realised that they're not covered for typhoid outbreaks. The policy does not cover them, so they should avoid going to early 20th century New York. That was a Typhoid Mary joke, by the way, if anybody's interested in medical history. It's a pretty simple application, right? It's like it's built with React. It's like a pretty simple form, very simple workflow, very low maintenance, except building on like new features on top of it. Never goes down until one Wednesday afternoon at, I should have to stop hitting spacebar. One Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. we get a production incident come through on our Slack channel, telling us that a bunch of customers are now getting an error has occurred, try again later messages whenever they hit the main screen. Before they start typing in the text box, they see this error. So after some hours trawling through Git logs, production logs, we discovered that the core team had pushed at least one or more unannounced releases to production for their event catalog API. So let's take a step back. What is a core team and what is the event catalog API? Jeez. All right, so the core team is a much bigger team in Inotech. Our squad, our So You Think You're Covered application uses a bunch of their services, the core team services. In fact, pretty much every other application in Inotech uses at least one core team application. They're all published via microservices, not Helidon, sorry. Some of them are Node applications. Most of them are Node applications, I should be honest. But in this case, Event Catalog API was a Java one. We are using one of the services. The relationship looks like relationship looks like this. So this is so you think you're covered. We use a single service on event catalog, just a catalog endpoint, and it returns us a list of events. In that diagram there, you can, if we think back to the original slide where I was explaining consumer-driven contract tests, in this case, so you think you're covered is consuming event catalog data, consuming. The event catalog API is producing event catalog data. So that's important to remember. So a few weeks earlier, before that, there was actually an announced change for the contract of the event catalog API, that catalog endpoint, where an extra parameter was added. It was a bit of a rush job because deadlines. So there was a bit of tech debt acquired. After the release, it turned out that the core team who looks after the event catalog API had pushed out some unannounced changes to fix up some of this tech debt, which caused the following issue. So you'll see that in this response where there are no events for a particular catalog that was requested, it was changed to this, which is a bit of a classic error, a classic problem. Ignore the fact that this is much better resolution than that screenshot. That has nothing to do with the error.
Because it's newer.
Yes, that's right, because it's newer. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So weren't there integration tests? Good question. There actually was integration tests. But they were turned off, as integration tests tend to get turned off when over time. I think that's a general rule. The longer an application has integration tests, the less likely integration tests are going to be running. When I asked a bunch of the team members why the integration tests were turned off, the usual sort of responses come through. They're brittle, they give misleading failures, they're slow, both to run and to fix when they fail, because they fail often. They're expensive to maintain, they're distracting, and they couple delivery pipelines. So just out of interest, I had a look at the event catalog API's Git log, and it turns out they do have integration tests running. But what they actually did was, before they pushed out their change to change the empty array to a null, they changed their integration tests, but didn't tell anybody else, which was wonderful. So they had tests effectively validating their expectations of the data that they were returning, but nothing was verifying the consumer's expectations. Right. So is there a better way than integration tests? So I started a spike to find out. So I was aware of the work that DiUS has been doing and others on Pact. So I came up with this hypothesis because I knew I could count on some DiUS resources to help me out. My hypothesis was: can consumer-driven tests can prevent production issues like this from occurring? So let's walk through how that would work, and this slide will give a bit more context on how consumer-driven tests would work in practice. So we have a consumer. In this case, so you're thinking of covered. We have producer, event catalog. At step one here, as mentioned before, the consumer defines the contract within its own test suite. So a Pact test is just a normal JUnit test, or Spock if you're a spec lover. Nothing wrong with that. Specs are good. That will run during the usual test phase of your CD pipeline. So it's just another test that runs within. You can I've mostly seen it being talked about as a separate test step within the pipeline. I think Brian might give you a bit more. Yeah, okay. So sometimes it runs in your normal unit test phase, sometimes not. Okay. So the test defines the expectations that the consumer has on a producer. So that is when the consumer contacts A, the endpoint A, and sends it B, it expects C in return. That's effectively what a contract is. Ideally, the test you write will verify actual production code that you're running. So the actual test will test the client code that is connecting to the producer, to the producer endpoint, which is handled by 2. So at step 2, those expectations are used by Pact to produce a mock provider that your client code will contact instead. So the client code, instead of contacting a real-life service, will contact the mock, and that mock is produced for you by way of the contract that you build in the test. You'll see this in code soon, and it'll probably become a lot clearer. Probably. So at step 3, which isn't on here, step 3 down here. So after the tests have passed, Pact produces a contract file, which is known as a Pact, funnily enough. That describes the consumer's expectations on the provider. So it's a JSON file with a set of, or list of expectations of interactions with the endpoint and their expectations of what response they're expecting. So that file at point 4, down here, at point 4, that Pact file needs to be distributed to the producer's build at some point. So that can be done, because it's just a normal file, it can be done through, I've seen it done through email. You can put it on a Slack channel, but most likely you'll stick it on like a Dropbox, not Dropbox, but like a S3, for example, or the Oracle equivalent. What is the Oracle equivalent S3?
OSA block storage.
There you go.
Object storage.
Cool, all right. All that. There's other tools you can use, one that I may mention later, just because I don't want to make it confusing right about now. So at point 5, I'm going to try to press the N. What does that do? There we go. Point 5 is the actual the producer verification stage. This is where the producer runs its own code. So it spins up an instance of itself, so an instance of the API, the microservice, and verifies the contract against itself. So it actually replays the interactions that were recorded at step 1 back against itself. It then takes the results and compares it at 6. And I should note that the producer tests are just a normal JUnit test as well, or a Spock test. So it's not like a new language you need to learn really. But the important bit to get out of this is the disconnectedness of this process. So these are run in 2 separate builds with only having effectively one pipeline running at a time. So each pipeline not actually connecting to any other service. So you don't have to spin up like an instance of the event catalog API in order to test so you think you're covered. Pact does that all for you. Same on the producer side. So effectively, you're not coupling your build pipelines together anymore. So, right, code time. In this project, I have a consumer and a provider. I'm going to need another pizza box. So they're both Spring Boot apps. Nothing special about them. The consumer, which is an analog for so you think you're covered, it's effectively just an API app. It has a single controller with a single endpoint, which is policy search, which takes a date and a policy number, and get some results. Crucially, it contacts the event catalog client, which looks like this. It is just a REST template, Spring REST template. I'm assuming most people use that if you're using Spring. That's it, nothing too special. The producer is the one with the event catalog API. It has a single endpoint as well. Fetch catalog, well, just a catalog with a catalog number. Each policy is tied to a catalog number. And it takes a date and a catalog identifier. I have a Swagger document, or Open API document for it. It looks like this. This is the producer. It has that. All right. Let's have a look. So we got some Pact tests already written. We have one test that I've written so far. So this is the consumer side. So this is where we define the contract between the consumer and the provider. It's consumer driven after all. So let me just format that properly because IntelliJ likes to mess around with my formatting for this. So what's this saying? So this is saying, we'll go and have a look at the test first, but the actual test in a second. But this is where, so we're saying we have a provider that this consumer contacts. It is the event catalog provider, and that's what we need. So, and all that's using is just a JUnit rule. I'm assuming everyone's familiar with JUnit rules. If you use JUnit, yes, good. So yeah, it's just a standard JUnit rule, nothing too special. It's what tells it actually starts up the mock in the background when the tests kick off. So we use this Pact annotation to define a method that returns effectively a contract. It's a Pact, the request response Pact in this case. There are different types of Pacts, but I'm not going to go into those today. So this one is saying, given the producer is in a default state. So one of the neat things you can do with Pact is define different states that the provider is in. So you can run like chained tests to say that if when I send this, I get this back, but then when I send this subsequently, then I also get a different result back. So you can do tests like that using Pact, which is nice, but we're not going to do that tonight. Saying when the producer is in this default state, upon receiving an event catalog request, this is just documentation, at this path, catalog 1, using query string this, and HTTP method get, it's going to respond with a 200 response, so okay, with a body that looks like this. So what this is, this is the Pact JSON DSL. Anybody familiar with property-based testing? Done property-based testing in the past? I mean, I know I saw someone LambJam shirt on before. You might have done. Anyway, it's very big in Haskell world. Anyway, so this is saying that it's saying the Pact has it's saying that the JSON response needs to look like this. So it needs an event that it has a attribute called events, which is an array. That's what the each like method is saying. And each of the objects in that array have a item ID attribute, description attribute, and an effective from attribute. And because effective from is a date, I need to tell it to return some fixed thing. Otherwise, it's just going to return garbage. And when I try and parse it as a date, it's going to fail. So you can. So when Pact sets up the mock, if it receives one of these Pact DSL JSON body instead of a fixed response, it will generate this data for you. So it'll actually go through and generate an events array with an arbitrary number of elements in it, each with this data. Item ID doesn't have a canned item, so it'll generate an item ID for you. So like just a random string, same with description or desk, etc. So yeah, so pretty simple. Pretty simple response anyway. And then because it's a builder, we need to actually build it, and we call that to Pact thing. And that returns a contract back to Pact. So in the test itself, we need to annotate the test with Pact verification, which tells Pact to start the mockup or make sure the mock's running. The catalog provider test is going to test to make sure that when we send this request, then when we send that request through the event catalog client, which is the client I showed before, the REST template, the response is not going to be empty, and which is the assert false, and each of the elements in the array are not going to be, well, none of the values are going to be null. So that's pretty standard JUnit test, although, I mean, I don't usually recommend you write loops in tests, so ignore that, please. So that's it, and we can run that now. We can run that without starting another instance, like the producer instance. Just run it like a normal test. Wait a certain amount of time for the build. There we go. And there you go. And the test has passed. So it's you can see in the logs, and it debugs out the logs. Hopefully you can change that. It says that it ran this request and generated some data and verified it. So the result of running that is the Pact file I talked about before. Let's have a look, see what that looks like. Here we go. So it's got a, actually, let me just rerun that because it's an old version of that file. Just 1 second. All right, so this is an example of a Pact, so it's just JSON. So it's platform agnostic. It describes the interaction that occurred. So get catalog 1. If you really want, you can write these from hand, but don't recommend that. So when I get that request, then it's expecting this response. And it has these matching rules, which at this JSON path, then I'm expecting type. Anyway. And this header, yes. And it tells you what generators it used, random strings, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's the file that we will now send on to our producer. So down here, we have a producer. And we are going to stick this in its Pact directory, delete this old version of it. No, I do not. And we're going to run the producer test. So this is what the producer test looked like. It is going to be run with, it's just a JUnit test, JUnit test class. It's going to be run with this particular runner. Which is a Pact runner. We're running in a Spring Boot app, so it needs to know that it's running in a Spring Boot app. We're going to tell it to pick the Pact files up from this Pact folder underneath the directory. If you're using other methods to fetch those Pact files, this is where you define them. If you're using Pact Broker, for example, which is the thing I haven't mentioned yet, it's saying that this is testing this provider, so it knows to only test those packs in that directory. We give it a Spring Boot test target, which is the server that's going to be running on port 8080. And if we had more than a few different types of state, this is where we define those. But note, there are no other @test methods defined here. They all get generated by Pact, by the interactions that are in that file. So I'm going to run this file now. Run this test now. And it knows to start up the Spring Boot app. and it has generated a test based on the interactions in that Pact file and replayed it against the provider endpoint. So it's saying verifying Pact between the consumer and the provider, and it's all okay. So the test passed. Brilliant. Okay, so what about when it fails? So rather than me type it out, I'm going to cheat and go hash. All right. So now what I've done is I've added an extra test to an extra contract to the consumer test to try and replicate that issue that we saw before, where if we receive there are no catalog, if there's no data to be returned from that catalog API, then we receive an empty array, not null. So what I've done is I have set up another contract here. Now Pact does have ways of DSL for reusing different parts of the contract, so you don't have to repeat yourself over and over, which I haven't used here, but if you're interested, you can look that up. So we're going to, so for this consumer, we need to tell it, yes, because I'm now using, instead of using that DSL for defining a JSON document up here, the other way you can do it is define a fixed response, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm telling it that when I hit the catalog endpoint with a date that's well in the past, which I'm expecting to be empty, never mind that for the moment, then I'm expecting a JSON document that looks like that. So that's an alternative way of defining a contract body anyway. And now I'm defining another test down here, which will verify that we are getting a empty array when we run it. So let's just run this again. So now we have two tests and both have passed. So so we know the consumer code functions properly with that response, which is good. And if we have a look at the Pact file now, we'll see two interactions. So there's one interaction which I've just collapsed, and this other one here, which has basically the same thing, except when I pass a much earlier date, which is going to cause no events to be returned, then return with a body that looks like that. So now let's see it break in the producer. So we go copy that file to the producer, overwrite, and we go back to the producer test, rerun it. We should see two tests come up, and with the second one failing. Yep. What do I do there? Could be the right folder. Okay, so you may have to take my word for it, rather than me spend 10 minutes debugging this. But I swear it does, it does fail. This is where you can laugh at me for attempting to do live coding on the night without video recording it. Try running it again. Here we go. All right, so No idea why that failed the first time. So the first test passed that we had before, and we can see that the second one has failed now because it is attempting to match the body that we defined, which is the events relating to an empty array. That has failed for this reason, because it received null, but got it received null but was expecting an empty array. So we can go through and fix that, but I'm conscious of time. It's 20 past. That's me stumbling through a. There we go. So what conclusions can we draw from this? So can consumer-driven contract testing help prevent production issues? Yes! Exclamation mark. But what I showed you really isn't the recommended way of using Pact anyway. So I really only showed you how Pact can be used to prevent production bugs from burning down your critical infrastructure. But I haven't really touched on the true superpowers that Pact has. So consumer-driven contract testing in particular is an effective test-driven design tool that you can use in your tests it's an effective test-driven design tool that you can use in you can have in your tool chest, because it allows the consumer to drive the features of the provider as it should be. Because if you think about it, if the provider doesn't function or doesn't meet the needs of its consumers, then what is it doing? I mean, it's a liability. It isn't providing value for the business. So by using Pact and the like, it enables you to keep that nice and tight, that relationship nice and tight. It's also a really neat way of facilitating discussions early on with the producer, the provider, and the consumer teams. If you watch a lot of YouTube presentations on Pact, one in particular, which is given by Beth Scurry, who's one of our consultants down in Melbourne, she does a really good one now, 2017. Talking about how Pact can allow teams to produce code, or to deliver a lot faster, because their feedback loops are a lot quicker, without having to rely on other teams, without having to couple delivery pipelines together. It's a really good talk, and I recommend everybody watch that at some point. She does a lot better job of selling Pact than I do. Would Pact have prevented this issue? Would a little more communication have prevented the issue from happening? Probably. That's it. Questions? Yes?
So this now comes from the consumer, but in some real-life scenarios, you've got multiple consumers and only one producer.
Yes.
So this expects that the consumer does its test, and then the consumer has this expectation of a producer,
Yep.
sends it to the producer, and
Yep.
then the producer actually has to test all the consumer expectations.
Yes.
So in this case, you only had one consumer, so it was really easy for the producer. But this core team that you have, maybe you have 20 other people consuming that stuff.
Yep.
Why would they do this for you? Because you're a consumer. They just might think.
Well, think about how many tests they would have to do manually every time they did a release to make sure that their, say, 5 or 6 or 20 different consumers were all still functioning after they made a small change to their contract.
That depends on how much they care.
Well, I mean, if your provider team doesn't care about its consumers, then they can piss off, right?
They were like this big. They were like the core team or whatever. You were sitting there all by yourself, and the bottom right somewhere being small and puny.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
We all know the politics of these things. They've done something that's right, and you just have to follow.
Yeah. Okay. So Pact doesn't fix political issues. I can guarantee that. That's still going to be an issue. Yes. Sure.
Now, because officially they made a contract-breaking API change. They screwed you over.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, I guess the argument was if they had these tests in the first place, then they wouldn't have been able to release. The build pipeline would have failed.
So how would it look with multiple customers? Would they just collect all those
Yeah, so
they would do it in a loop, and then when they see an error, they tell you and not them because they are doing everything right.
yeah, so the error if they had say X consumers to their one service, there would be an aggregation of those Pact files somewhere. I briefly mentioned Pact Broker before. That's the preferred way of distributing these packs. It's an open source project which you can use to as like a dashboard for dashboard and like a aggregation for packs. Pack files. When the consumer runs, instead of dropping it onto an S3 bucket or sending it via email, it goes to Pact Broker. It lives in Pact Broker. Then when the provider test runs, it'll go and talk to Pact Broker to pull down all the packs for that are relevant to that producer, and then run them all. So Pact will do that automatically for you up to the point of the Pact Broker. So Pact will generate all those tests. So as you saw in that provider test, there was no @test defined in that class. They all get generated by the interactions that are in those files that are relevant to that producer.
They are assuming they are doing everything right. They are the producer.
Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
I have like two questions. One is there an extension implementation of the Spring restaurant for JUnit 5? And that's the first question.
Yeah, well, I use JUnit 4 in that example, but there is a JUnit 5 runner for it. Yeah.
Okay. My second one is could I just write a wrapper around some YMOC configurations and rest assured and achieve the same thing?
Sorry, say that again a bit later.
I could pretty much write a wrapper around some YMOC configuration and rest assured and I could pretty much achieve I think I could achieve what this is trying to do, but I'm not sure if there's any benefit apart from the extra work you have to do.
Well, I guess the benefit is you don't have to write yourself. That's always a big benefit. Also, if you wanted to talk to, do something similar to what Pact's doing, or even Spring Cloud Contracts are doing, you would need to, and you were talking to, say, a Ruby service, you would need to do the same thing on that Ruby service, probably write the same thing to verify. I think probably the biggest win of Pact is that polyglot ability. The fact that the Pact file itself is platform agnostic, and you can use it to test lots of different types of systems, lots of different enumerations of types of systems.
Also, what happens if you have a consumer provider test that run, right? And wouldn't it sort of matter about, let's say I have some pipeline, and these are some disconnected microservices existing in two different repositories that are supposed to be utilizing each other, and then one test gets run, and then the other test gets run on there's a race condition. Couldn't that also be possible?
A race condition because the contracts are different? Yeah, I mean that is an issue in practice that rarely happens, but maybe Brian might be able to give a bit more.
Pact Broker has kind of some labeling as well, so you just say, you can kind of tie down which version, so it's kind of irrelevant, so you can say I want to do version X and then version Y. So in a sense, the second one that will kick off probably, and there's different strategies because it can get quite involved. Do you then trigger the building, does the provider trigger a building of the consumers as well, and just run those Pact tests? But yeah, by actually going to Pact Broker and saying, I want this particular version that was published, or the latest one, you kind of get around it. Yeah, I've never heard of that.
You got to imagine what would happen if you didn't have Pact there anyway. I mean, what would happen if you had the consumer and the producer making changes to the contract without telling each other, which is presumably what's happened, and you don't have Pact there, you'd probably not find out until you went to the QA environment, or probably worse, production. So it's so having Pact there, even with a race condition on that contract, at least Pact's going to give you that feedback a lot earlier.
One of the new features I realised in the Pact Broker as well is in the dashboard you'll probably find that consumers are ready, it's all green, but the provider is all red. So it notifies you to go, okay, this is not ready to be released. So you can look at like different versions and stuff around that.
Think of it like a conversation starter. It's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to fix the code. But it just tells you there's a problem. And then it's not going to solve the whole piece.
Thanks for listening. You probably would have seen these QR codes around the place. There's one over there, they're all the same one. But you can scan it and it'll take you to a quick little 1-minute survey, which at the end will send you a link to, or take you to the Pact Broker website where you can sign up for a free hosted version of the Pact Broker, which is nice. So feel free to scan. I'll leave that up for 2 seconds. And thanks.